Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Kelly. I'm on the Historic Advisory Committee for the town of Victor, and we are the sponsors of the talks. And I'd like to welcome you all here. We tend to run about six or seven of these talks a year. We do 3 or 4 in the fall, and now we are just starting up again. They're all talks about having to do with local history of Victor and Farmington area. And we just to put in a plug for some of the ones that we've got coming up yet. Next May 5th, our next talk will be May 5th, and that's going to be John Marks, who is the historian. Excuse me, on the phone. If you could, I'm sorry. Our talk on May 5th is going to be John Marks, who's a historian from Geneva area, and he'll be talking on the developers, Phelps and Gorham, who did the original subdevelopment of this area on sort of a massive scale. And all of our town boundaries and the way it was all divided up, the fact that Canandaigua is our county seat, all that goes back to their original subdevelopment of this area. In like some other developers, they went bankrupt, and so did the developers that followed them. Actually, it turned out not to be a great way to make a lot of money, partly because of Hamilton and sort of building a bank, and they borrowed an awful lot of money to do the Phelps and Gorham purchase, and they really expected that the money would be worthless within a short time, and they'd be able to pay it back with worthless money, and they were sadly mistaken and had to pay it back with real money, and that turned out to be difficult. I think one or both of them ended up going to debtor's prison because of it. So John Marks, I'm really looking forward to having him come. And then Thursday, June 2nd, Mary Sue Holtz, who is a art teacher at the Victor Schools, is doing a talk on the Victor Schools, looking at it through the viewpoint of the yearbooks of the Bagel, Blue and Gold, Everlasting. And lost my train of thought, I'm sorry, but it should be an interesting talk. I've seen the Victor Schools have almost a complete collection of all the yearbooks going back. And the first yearbook, and it's not that old actually, wasn't started until the 1940s, and it was Eleanor Berry who was specifically hired to start the yearbook. She stayed a couple of years, and they didn't pay enough, so she went on to Kodak and made more money. But it's fascinating to look through and see, how styles have changed, how the size of classes, how the activities, and the whole general school system has changed over the years. So that should be a good talk. And just since I'm putting in plugs for things, one other thing that we've got coming up, there's an Old Village Cemetery tour on Saturday, May 7th. If you're not familiar with it, the Old Village Cemetery is a cemetery that's behind the Methodist Church and behind the Village Hall, sort of sits back out of the way. They haven't had a burial there in 60 or 70 years. The town maintains it. They do a super job, and thanks to a committee that got together and wanted to preserve it. Bonnie Waters, Diane Parks, really did a super job preserving that cemetery, and today it is one of the best kept little cemeteries you'll find, and hardly anybody even knows it's there. So we've got, Babette's going to be talking a little bit about the cemetery on that day, and then we have 5 people that will be portraying people that are buried there, sort of notable people that were buried there. So I think that if you haven't been to that cemetery, it's a great way to be introduced to it. That's coming up on May 7th. It's a Saturday afternoon, about 3 o'clock. So that's what we have on. And now for tonight's program. Pat was showing me the video that you're going to see tonight, and when I first saw it, I was so impressed with it, and I said, wow, I mean, it really takes you back to when a lot of us were young in this area. So Pat Bolger is going to be our speaker, and his uncle, Ed Blazey, is also here. Ed was in the film originally, and is going to also give some thoughts about what it was like putting that film together. So, Pat, we'll start with you. And
thank you, Bob, for the introduction. Me being the speaker is maybe a bit of an overstatement. I'm going to introduce folks, the movie and my Uncle Ed. But this is a film, well, actually going back to when Bob and I first showed this to Bob, we were volunteering one evening at Serenity House, and things were getting a little quiet, and so I pulled up this video link, and that's when Bob first saw it and thought, well, let's, eventually, this was all pre-COVID, so we had to wait for COVID to pass, and now we're able to present it to a larger group. So this is a film from back in the 1953, I think, about my grandparents' farm on 332. And my uncle will speak to this, but there's some buildings left, but it's adjacent to where the Troopers Barracks is currently located, on the same side of 332 as the Troopers Barracks. And my mom is in it. They refer to her as Alberta instead of Roberta. But the real treat, when I agreed to do this and present this film with Bob, I didn't know for sure whether my Uncle Ed Blazey, so my Uncle Ed Blazey and his wife Mary are here this evening. And it's a special treat to have someone who was in this film in several of the scenes here to actually kind of give a behind the scenes, literally behind the scenes explanation of what went on during the filming of this production. So I thank you all for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to my Uncle Ed. I think they refer to him as Eddie in the movie, do they? Okay. He hasn't changed a bit, and so I'll turn it over to my Uncle Ed Blazey.
Thank you. I'll make a few remarks about the movie before we show it, because I think it would be better rather than to interrupt the movie itself. It starts out with a little yellow schoolhouse. Well, from here, Tony Imhoff, who is 16 years old at the time, in 1953, is riding up the Hudson River on train and comes into Canandaigua. And then he gets on a little yellow school bus. Well, that was Van Aken's school bus. We called it the cheese box. But that stopped at our house. It turned around at our house because that's the end of our school district. Then from the little yellow schoolhouse, he enters the property and visits my mother, introduces himself. Then shortly afterwards, he goes to a graveyard. He is walking around and he just kind of walks into a graveyard that's an old one, and it's kitty corner across from Country Backs on Shortsville Road, if you all know that area. It's still there, And maybe someone is investigating it to find out where it did start and who was there. Then shortly after that, they come upon me riding a tractor. We did not have any farm Ford equipment. That was borrowed from Pete Hathaway at Hathaway's Corner. Then it comes to unloading hay, and Tony remarks that they're like lead. They weighed about 70 pounds, 75 to 80 pounds. We produced quite a bit of hay in the neighborhood of about 900 tons a year. Then there's the dinner scene. Back then, the noon meal was the dinner, the large meal. And it was filmed 4 different times. The people who produced the movie were a little bit of a nuisance on the farm occasionally because they interrupted so many things. But in the film, you'll see just one pass with a dinner. But there were 4 times we prayed, 4 times we passed the dishes. The reason they did that is because one time somebody dropped the dish and they had to clean up after it. Another time the chicken fell off the dish. Now, 3rd time, I'm not sure why, and the 4th one was fairly successful. But you'll see the expression on my mother's face because it took about 2 hours or more. She bites into a chicken leg, and if you recall her expression, it wasn't too good. The chicken was cold and old. After that, there's what I would call a big goof. This is about halfway into the movie, just a few minutes, not maybe 10, 15 minutes into the movie. The big goof is that time, the upper echelon of the Ford Motor Company starts to review some of what's been filmed. And they've discovered that what we had was an international 12-foot combine, and Johnny Madrino was hired by Dad to help harvest the wheat. And he had a Massey Harris combine. No Fords. So none of that is in the film. None of the wheat harvest is actually in the film from Farmington. From there, because at that time, the harvest was about over. So where are we going to get wheat harvest now? The people looked all over the country and finally ended up in Calgary, Alberta, where the wheat stand is still there. But the problem is they don't harvest like we do standing wheat. They cut it into windrows and let it mature on the ground because of the colder weather and moisture. The wheat doesn't mature. So when they cut it on the ground, it's like a flower. It wilts and it becomes more mature. So that's where, from then on, the movie goes back and forth between Farmington and Calgary, because what they do is just splice the 16 millimeter film together in pieces. So it's not really what you would call a whole series of continuity, unless you know about it or don't know about it. So from there, I missed one scene is where Tony is going to bed up in my bedroom, which is upstairs in the attic of this house that we were at, where we lived. Well, it was close to the attic. It wasn't really, it was a finished off bedroom, but it was next to the attic. But anyway, the heat was, in the summer, about 80 to 85 degrees. Was not comfortable at all. The film took place at about 11 a.m. in the morning, and here we are going to sleep. But that's better than having them come back at 11 o'clock at night and try to film. But that's one little tidbit about the continuity of the movie. Tony, by the way, did not live at the house. He did not ever spend one night at the house. The movie people rented the apartments down across from Deep Pacific. Actually, it was a motel. I'm not sure what the name of it was then, but that's where they stayed. They never stayed at the house. The people in the movie, or producing the movie, I didn't mention that yet, but there were 2 helpers, a person who had a portable camera, a wind-up 16 millimeter camera, and then the producer, who was Peasley Bond, who walked around with one of these little square things that he looked through to see what the frame was going to look like when it was filmed. But those are the people who sort of got in the way once in a while. One thing they did very often, they had reflectors that are about this big, and they're mounted on a frame, and they projected light, regular ambient sunlight, onto whatever they were filming. Quite often they got in the way, but that was beside the point. They did their purpose anyway. So let's see. In the background, you might notice that on the hedgerows, in some of the places, you see the American elm, which is just on its way, well, the beginning of the end of the American elm at that time in 1953. But there are good, healthy trees at that time, but they were not lasting long. I think from here, I'll go ahead and have them stream the movie, and then what I was going to plan on doing is just calling out Calgary, Farmington, when they change, because it's not quite obvious, except for the machinery that they use in Calgary. It's entirely different. As I mentioned, they put it in windrows, and then 3 or 4 or 5 days later come along and pick it up and thrash it that way. There's a rainstorm in Farmington at our house, at the barn actually. It was McElvey with a pumper in Canandaigua at that time, came out with a hose, shot a hose water up in the air, and it came down as rain. The sun was shining, it was beautiful weather, but that's how they made rain in Farmington. In Calgary, they actually did have a rainstorm. And you'll see, for one thing, you'll see the lightning flash and hear the thunder. That's in Farmington. Now, this, right back immediately to the combines in Calgary, it's raining. But that's how they spliced this together. You wouldn't know it unless you were there. They could, as I mentioned before, they couldn't find any more grain except the Calgary, and so they shipped Dad out there all by himself. They didn't take, Tony didn't go, I didn't, none of us went. So he's alone out there with the people in Calgary at the farm, and I'm not sure what the farm was or is, but anyway, that's, so I think from there I'll just call out the location.
Sounds good. I do think I forgot to mention my grandparents' names during the introduction. So it was Everett and Elizabeth Blazey, and their farm was, as I mentioned, kind of adjacent to where the the Troopers Barracks is, down to where the racetrack is. So it was that piece of property on that side
Oh,
of 332.
Was it?
How many acres?
Oh, we had 800 acres, and then across the road, directly across, was another 200-acre field that we rented from Pete Hathaway. Every year, we bought about 150 head of heifers from Pete Hathaway and raised them to, as dairy stock, and then sold them as I guess, cows later on. But that was on an annual basis, so they had a big business deal. Dad had a big business deal with Pete Hathaway, buying cattle as well as renting land from him. So, yeah, we had 200 acres of corn usually, about 180 acres of hay, 200 acres of wheat, and 80 acres of oats, and spread out over the farm. So I guess we can stream it now if that's what you...
I think we're ready to...
Okay, so just before I move the camera, I didn't want to take it off you for school.
Questions? Oh, questions?
Oh,
Pete Hathaway is our grandfather, so we're
Oh.
here too. And we saw this movie when we were in 7th grade social studies.
Oh.
And had to convince our teachers that it was
right, yes. Yes.
our farm and your farm.
I should mention, it was shown all over the U.S. in schools,
Yes.
as well as in several foreign countries. So probably some people, like you say, have seen it in school, that is. So, okay. Yep.
This was the day. No more school for the rest of the summer. And I was getting away from this crazy city as fast as I could catch a train. It used to be, farm boy goes to the big city. With me, it's just the opposite. I get a kick out of everything that grows out of the ground. Anything from grass in the park to Ma's geranium pot on the fire escape. So I got myself a summer job upstate, working on a farm. So long, hot streets. So long, noise and hurry. I'm on my way. Funny how quick a big city ends when you get on a train. Just a few minutes and you're out in the country. Farm after farm. Makes you think maybe the city's not as important as you thought. When you get to the station, take a yellow bus, they said. Just ask the driver to let you off at Blazey's farm. Well, there it was. Didn't look much different from what I'd expected. Pretty, though. Nobody seemed to be home. Wondered if I had the wrong place. Finally had sense enough to go around back. And there was Mrs. Blazey hanging out clothes on the line. She seemed nice and friendly, but I could tell she was looking me over pretty carefully. I guess she didn't know what to expect either. Mind your manners now, Maud told me. So I grabbed the clothes and carried them in. Dropped a couple of pieces on the way, of course. All hands and feet. She took me up to the room I was going to share with her son, Eddie. Said he was 16 too, and we ought to get along fine. I sure hope so. You'll probably find Mr. Blazey out in the back 40, she said, whatever that meant. Didn't want to look dumb, so I said, yes, ma'am. I asked how big the farm was, and she said about 800 acres, and off I went. I walked 5 minutes, didn't see a soul. Then a big field of wheat stopped me. Didn't dare walk through it, afraid I'd trample some down and ruin it. Might take it out of my pay. You can say 800 acres quick, but when you start walking around in it, you never saw anything so big. By now, I was really lost. Climbed a fence, and what do you think I saw? A graveyard, way out there in the middle of nowhere. I prowled around, looked at the tombstones. You know, some of them dated way back to 1867. Well, these people must have been farming here before the Civil War. Heard a tractor coming and thought maybe that's Eddie. And so it was. We hollered at each other for a while. Then I made out that his father was down by the lower barn. I remember when I first saw Mr. Blazey, I got the feeling he could work all day and never get tired. There was a feeling of power back of everything he did, even the way he shook hands. I felt pretty self-conscious in my new work clothes, but he said I looked more like a farmer than a city boy already. And how about giving him a hand with those bales? I liked him right away. Just pulling bales of hay onto a conveyor looks easy. You know how it is on a new job. You want to show the boss how good you are. The first couple of bales went fine. Nothing to it. Then I began to think they must have lead in them. A lot of bales on that truck. I didn't know whether I'd be able to get through that first afternoon or not. If Mr. Blazey was wondering how his kids would hit it off with a city boy, he didn't have to worry. Alberta and I got along fine, and everybody found plenty to talk about. By the time Mrs. Blazey brought on the food, I didn't feel like a stranger anymore. The food was terrific. After dinner, Eddie asked me what my favorite TV show was, and he turned it on for me. Felt strange sitting there so far from home and seeing the same show I'd have been looking at back in the city. The only trouble was I couldn't stay awake. I finally gave up and went upstairs to bed.
I'm sailing up the Gulf of Mexico.
So then a crazy thing happened. I couldn't get to sleep. Who says it's quiet in the country? They've got the weirdest noises out here I ever listened to. How can that guy sleep through all this? I should have stayed in the city where I belong. As I thought it would to get used to farm routine. After a few days, I was out there with Eddie at the crack of dawn, chasing cows or whatever else needed doing. I had a lot to learn. On a farm, you have to be able to do almost everything yourself. Mr. Blazey had a machine shop where he could repair equipment if it broke down. He could weld a broken part or even make a new one if it wasn't too complicated. Eddie was such a good mechanic, he made me feel dumb. He could take apart almost every machine his father owned and put it together again without any pieces left over. I didn't even know how to sharpen a cutter bar, but I made up my mind to learn. Sometimes a farmer has to turn carpenter, know how to build himself a shed or a house even. If he needs extra help, maybe a neighbor comes over and lends a hand. Next time, you go over and help him. People on farms don't ask for anything unless they really need it. So when a man does ask, you never say no. Mr. Blazey kept telling me, the only way you learn a thing is by doing it. But I guess I didn't really believe him, till one afternoon when he took time out to show me how a tractor works. After he got through explaining, he said, "Okay, now get on and drive it." I was scared to try, but he said, "Go ahead, can't hurt anything. You got the whole field all to yourself." Well, I figured it was all right with him, it was all right with me. So I got set, put her in gear. I guess even the cows laughed. But Mr. Blazey shouted, "You're doing fine." Mr. Blazey was always learning new things himself. He said a farmer had to stay in business. Why, he knew as much about biology and botany and chemistry as most school teachers. All about fertilizers, insecticides, soil conservation. He says it takes all that just to raise one ear of corn. He was always in a huddle with the county agent or some other expert. And just the way they'd strip an ear and stand there talking about everything from borers to bacteriology was an education all by itself. Sometimes I just sat down and looked, trying to soak up the feeling of things living and growing. It was all there spread out in front of me, if I could only understand it. Everything in nature has a purpose, said Mr. Blazey, whether it's the sun, or the way grain grows on a stalk, or insects carrying pollen from plant to plant. It's all necessary, all part of the scheme of things. I thought that over for a while, but something bothered me. What purpose do weeds serve, I asked him. And what about pests and diseases that attack the plants? What about drought and storms? Well, Tony, he said, there's evil in the world just the way there's good. And in a way, being a farmer means being on the side of what's good in nature and helping it to live and grow and protecting it against all the things that try to hurt it or kill it. I remember seeing him walk to the top of a rise one afternoon and stand there looking out across the fields. And the way he walked through the wheat and felt it, it gave you the feeling he was personally concerned with every stalk. And in a way, he was. He'd planted it. He'd helped it grow. He'd fought off whatever had tried to hurt it. And now there it stood, almost ready. I knew he was holding his breath, hoping his luck would hold till he could harvest it. His luck did hold. The blades of the swathers chopped down the wheat and laid it out on the field in long rows to dry. Now, every day for 4 days, the hot sun beat down and dried the wheat, until Mr. Blazey could tell by the feel of it that it was ready for the combines. Mr. Blazey says nobody under 50 is old enough to appreciate a modern combine. He can remember harvesting the wheat with horses, an old-fashioned equipment made of wood and iron that broke down and left you stranded in the middle of a field. 15 years ago, he had to hire 18 men to do the same job only 5 of us were handling here. The combine alone has cut down labor by 85%, and with just one combine, he can harvest more than 30 acres a day. The baler followed the combine and finished off the whole job in one operation. All day long we worked together like clockwork. Each time the combine got full, we'd run up the truck and siphon it off. You know, said Mr. B, in colonial days it took 85% of the nation's manpower to produce the food we needed. Now 15% can do the job. Think of all the extra manpower that gives us. And doing away with horses and mules means we don't have to grow the food to feed them. That gives us millions more acres than we had to grow food for people instead of animals. I took away more new ideas than I did wheat that day. We didn't get back to the house from breakfast on. Kept shuttling back and forth between the field and the barn. Here again we had a machine to help us, a conveyor that Mr. Blazey had figured out and built himself. It carried the wheat to the bins in a steady flow and saved us a lot of time. Mr. B kept the pressure on. He was just a little uneasy about the weather. He had asked Alberta to bring us out a snack around 4 in the afternoon, so we could keep working straight through till dark. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, but he'd heard a weather report that said there was a cold front moving east, and he didn't like the sound of it. We broke for a while, but we didn't really relax. We ate fast, the way you do when you're a little worried. Chewing and swallowing, but not really tasting any of it. But it made us feel better anyway. And there was the feeling between us that people get when they work together, all doing the same job. It was a good feeling. Then we went at it again, and now the wind began blowing in gusts, and you could smell the change coming in the air. Down went the sun, but we kept right on working. We didn't quit till it got too dark to see. That night after dinner, Mr. B sat close to the radio, keeping one ear cocked for weather reports. The parlor was full of girls having a meeting of the 4-H. Mrs. Blazey is the volunteer leader of Alberta's 4-H club. All the kids out here belong either to 4-H or the Future Farmers of America, and they learn a lot and have fun doing it. Alberta was smart at designing clothes. She was going to try for a prize at the county fair. I sure wished her luck.
This is station QLXR, station QLXR. Montgomery County reports winds with a velocity of 40 miles.
9 o'clock, we got a weather report of wind and hail moving southeast, right in our direction.
Center of storm is moving over
bad for tomorrow.
Junction.
Sunrise told us nothing, but the weather reports were still bad. A neighbor brought his combine over to help, and we started working against time. For a while, it looked as if we might make it. Then it hit us. We really did get rained out. Down it came, and every now and then we could hear a clatter of hailstones bouncing against the roof. I figured the wheat must be ruined, and I sure felt sorry for poor Mr. Blazey after all the work he had done. But Eddie didn't think there'd been much damage. Maybe we lost a little, he said, but it could have been a lot worse. One Saturday, we decided to do a little shopping and take in the county fair. We all piled in the car and drove to town. The roads were good, and it wasn't much of a drive, only about 25 minutes. And I didn't think about it one way or the other, until Mrs. Blazey started telling me how much the town had changed in 20 years. With all the cars and different kinds of stores, it was almost like a little city. I liked it better than a city. There was a friendly feeling to it you don't get in big cities. Everybody taking his time and doing what he wanted.
That's Betty Malatesta.
Like us. Eddie and I were going to buy a haircut. Alberta wanted to catch up on the latest fashions. Mr. Blazey went down to the dealer's lot to look over the new line of trucks and farm equipment. all going to meet back at the car in an hour. Eat dinner in town, then go see the fair that evening. After the last crop had been harvested, Mr. Blazey had a long session with his account books. I can remember how he sat there going over the entries page by page. I guess it had been a pretty good year for him, but from the expression on his face, I had a feeling he wasn't really looking at the figures half the time. He was seeing the farm itself and thinking about it. Figures in a book don't show how a farm looks at sunrise, or how the shadow of a cloud moves across a field, or the way wheat whispers in the wind. Figures don't show all the work a man's hands have done, all the thought and the planning and the skill, or the worry and the disappointment. The way Mr. Blazey feels about his farm goes deeper than profit and loss. His farm is as much a part of him as his head or his heart. You couldn't take it away from him without killing him. Summer was over before I knew it. We stood on the station platform saying
That's the
goodbye.
Ken Davis wind station.
Come again next summer. We'll make a real farmer out of you, said Mr. Blazey. Which made me feel pretty good, because coming from him, it was a real compliment. Thanks, I said. There's nothing I'd like better. I was glad they seemed to like me. Pass and thought about them. I kept feeling I'd had a first-hand look at something exciting and important that was going on all over this country. Machines clattering up and down the fields, farmers working hand in hand with scientists. Mr. Blazey says the farmers are going to have to feed 190 million people by 1975, and that if anybody thinks big changes have been made in agriculture, he hasn't seen anything yet. I wonder what it'll be like by the time I have a farm of my own.
Just a couple more comments. That was 1953. 5 years later, 400 acres were sold to the racetrack. 400 acres. And then about 2 years later, Dad was 52. Okay, I think I said that. Anyway, about 2 or 3 years later, another 400 acres were sold to Farmbrook, where they built several, I think close to over 1,000 houses. And then several acres were sold to the Troopers Barracks, which is now expanding into quite a good size. And so there's not much left of the farm itself. In fact, there's nothing left. But he was ready to retire, so there was no doubt about it.
One of the structures that is left is
Yeah.
the cinder block barn where you saw the welding going on.
Yes.
That's MC Automotive now.
Yes.
So that building still isn't.
Yeah, that is the original cinder block barn that was built in 1946, because in 1945, the main large barn burned to the ground in December in a huge snowstorm. In fact, they used rotary plows to bring the fire engines to the fire. But that was a while back.
We take a couple of questions. Yes, sure. And if you have any questions, you can, like, just so that.
Yeah, sure. If I can hear it.
Mary told me that film was initiated.
Yes.
How did they pick the place?
Well, we don't know. They didn't really tell us. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, they didn't really tell us why, but Dad was quite well known in the area. He was on the bank boards of Canandaigua and Victor. Production credit. He was in the Genesee Valley Market in Rochester. He was a justice of the peace during the film. So I think the year before, someone may have come by and seen the wheat fields and decided, well, this might be a good place. But other than that, we have no idea. So, yes.
Pictures of the town.
What? I'm sorry.
The pictures of the town, what town
Oh, Canandaigua. Yes, and I don't know if I mentioned Buddy Melatello, but Buddy Melatello was one of them. That Ford that we drove was a loaner. We did not have Ford equipment.
Question in the back?
Yeah.
Your father was Everett.
Your father was Everett?
Yes.
Everett Senior.
Was he raised on the farm there?
Was I?
Well, no, was he?
Was he?
Yeah.
He bought the farm, a small part of it, in somewhere in the mid-20s. And from there, he just continually expanded. Oh, he was, I don't know his age at that time, but, yes.
Saw that movie in 1955 at Bloomfield Central School.
Oh, okay. All right, good.
I remember that film just like it was yesterday,
I'll be darned.
especially the guy walking around.
Yes.
The field instead of walking. It's stuck in my mind.
Oh, rock over there. Much water for the cows or?
Did we have rock?
So it said the soil was pretty rocky as far as.
Oh, it wasn't that rocky, but it was heavy clay. So that a three-bottom plow was the best we could get through with a tractor, a wheel tractor. We had a D4, and with that we could pull a four-bottom in second gear. But other than that, it was not that rocky. The racetrack area was the best soil. That was very nice. But there was a gravel pit there. And so there was a little bit gravelly, but I don't think there were hardly any big rocks there. Anything that would, well, there were a few that would trip the plow now and then, but they were way underground. Yes.
Remember Blazey having
Yes.
an air strip out back?
Yes. That was, yes, he was, that was another thing. He was an avid member of the Flying Farmers. In 1946, he bought a Ronca Chief, a small airplane. And then he established the Victor Farmington Airfield and built a large Quonset hut that would hold several airplanes. That's still there on the racetrack property. I believe it's still there. They had a big fire there one time with hay bales burning up, but didn't destroy the Quonset hut.
And Ed got his flying license at age
Right, yes. And my sister, oldest sister, got her license, and my brother flew. He's in the movie, but we probably didn't notice him. It's hard to pick out all of those things. But yes, we were very much a flying family. And that plane was sold in 1958. It's still flying in Baldwinsville, yes.
Is Bert Blazey your sister?
Yes.
I knew her well.
Oh.
I idolized her.
Oh, really?
She was older than I was, and Ethel Hathaway
Oh,
got us connected. 4-H camp,
yes.
just
Oh, yes, yes.
I idolized her.
Yeah, we used to go to 4-H camp up in Bristol. But
Mom, Bert's my
she,
mom,
yes.
and she's currently at Ewing Continuing Care in long-term care.
Yeah, she's
No,
84.
Bert, it's
She's 84.
yeah, I'm 80.
Yes.
Idolized her.
Yeah, good. Oh, I think he has his hand up, okay.
Ford company paid your parents to do all this?
You know, I don't know what the finance system was. I have no idea. They didn't pay us. I think Tony was paid, but they did not pay us.
Didn't get an Oscar.
No.
No lucky lump slapped you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yep, you're welcome.
Thank you all for coming. If you did not sign in, the main reason for signing in is if you've got an email address, we will put you on our list and remind you that next time we do one of these. But thank you. It was a great presentation from both of you, and it was just wonderful to see you here, Ed. Thanks for all for coming. Oh, and Susie, thank you